What if this war was never only about war? What if, beneath the language of security and diplomacy, the real battle was always about cash flow, choke points, and control? And what if one sentence from Donald Trump just exposed the whole blueprint? Before we go further, subscribe to the channel and support our work. That support helps us keep producing sharp, serious analysis on the forces shaping America, the global economy, and the future of power. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Part 1, the moment the war changed, from pressure campaign to oil seizure talk. Donald Trump's statement that he wants to take the oil in Iran, and that the United States could seize Kharg Island easily, may sound like classic Trump provocation. But that reading is too shallow. This is bigger than a headline. Bigger than a media cycle. Bigger than another flash of wartime bravado. What we are hearing now is the possible public unveiling of a deeper doctrine: use military pressure not only to punish an enemy, not only to force a deal, but to seize the economic artery that keeps the enemy alive. That changes everything. For weeks, this conflict has been sold in the language of necessity. Nuclear risk. Regional instability. Deterrence. Counterforce. National security. But when a U.S. president openly talks about taking another country's oil, the mask slips. The frame changes. The mission no longer looks limited. It no longer sounds like a narrow campaign to reduce risk. It begins to look like direct economic coercion backed by military force. In plain terms, it starts to look like a war over who gets to control the money. And that is why Kharg Island matters so much. Kharg Island is not just a military target. It is not symbolic terrain. It is one of the most important nodes in Iran's oil export system. It is where energy becomes revenue, and revenue becomes state power. If you threaten Kharg Island, you are not just threatening infrastructure. You are threatening the financial lungs of the Iranian state. You are telling Tehran that Washington is no longer satisfied with pressure from the outside. Washington may now be thinking about putting its hand directly on the valve. This is where the danger becomes systemic. Because once war shifts from destroying capability to controlling assets, the strategic logic hardens fast. Oil is not just a commodity. It is the bloodstream of the global economy. A threat to Kharg Island is a threat to market stability, shipping assumptions, inflation expectations, and the political mood far beyond the Gulf. Traders hear risk. Allies hear escalation. Tehran hears economic strangulation. And American families may soon hear it in the language that matters most: higher prices. Trump's rhetoric also reveals the contradiction at the center of this moment. He says talks are going well. He says Iran may be ready for a deal. Yet at the same time, he talks like a man preparing the public for something much larger: seizure, extended presence, deeper control. That is not confusion. That is coercive bargaining at maximum intensity. Offer the language of peace while raising the price of refusal. But history gives us a warning. When leaders start talking as if foreign oil infrastructure is a reachable prize, they often underestimate the cost of what comes next. Taking is one thing. Holding is another. And in the Middle East, the line between leverage and entrapment is always thinner than Washington wants to believe. Part 2, Kharg Island: Why one piece of land could reshape the whole war. Kharg Island is where this war stops being abstract and starts becoming brutally concrete. On a map, it looks small. In the structure of power, it is enormous. This is the kind of place that reveals what wars are really about once the speeches fade and the slogans burn off. Not just security. Not just retaliation. Not just deterrence. Kharg Island sits at the intersection of money, energy, state survival, and military leverage. That is why Trump keeps circling back to it. And that is why the rest of the world should be paying very close attention. To understand Kharg Island, you have to understand a basic truth about modern states: they do not survive on flags and speeches alone. They survive on revenue. They survive on the ability to convert natural resources into cash, cash into salaries, salaries into loyalty, and loyalty into political endurance. Iran is no exception. Kharg Island is not merely one oil facility among many. It is a central artery in the export system that helps keep the Iranian state functioning under pressure. It is where barrels leave, dollars come in, and the machinery of national resilience keeps moving. That is what makes Kharg Island strategically seductive to Washington. If you are thinking in the language of maximum pressure, Kharg Island looks like the perfect pressure point. Hit it, seize it, or cripple it, and you are no longer just damaging infrastructure. You are directly attacking Tehran's ability to breathe financially. In war, that kind of target is irresistible to leaders who believe economic pain can force political surrender faster than diplomacy can. It offers the illusion of efficiency. One location. One decisive move. One shock to the system. One shortcut to leverage. But history is full of leaders who fell in love with shortcuts that turned into traps. Kharg Island may be easy to threaten in rhetoric. That is not the same as easy to control in reality. Strategic assets close to hostile territory are dangerous precisely because their value makes them magnets for retaliation. If the United States ever moved beyond threats and toward physical control, the mission would instantly become larger than the island itself. The problem would no longer be how to take Kharg Island. The problem would be how to hold it, defend it, resupply it, and justify it while Iran adapts around the new reality. And Iran would adapt. It would not need to win some grand conventional battle to turn Kharg Island into a burden for the United States. It would only need to make the holding cost rise. Missiles, drones, mines, harassment, attrition, political pressure, market shock, this is how weaker powers punish stronger ones. They do not defeat them head-on. They make their victories expensive. They make every inch of control feel temporary, exposed, and politically toxic. That is the deeper danger here. In modern conflict, the side that captures the prize can become the side trapped by the prize. There is also a larger economic truth that makes Kharg Island even more explosive. Oil infrastructure is not like ordinary territory. Its value depends not just on possession, but on stable function. A damaged export hub, a threatened terminal, or an island under constant military pressure cannot operate normally. That means even a so-called successful move against Kharg Island could still drive the exact instability that Washington claims it wants to control. Markets do not reward boldness by default. They reward predictability. And Kharg Island, once turned into an active battlefield, becomes the opposite of predictability. That is why Kharg Island matters beyond Iran. It is a pressure point in the global system. A threat there sends signals through shipping routes, insurance markets, oil futures, inflation forecasts, and alliance calculations. Gulf states hear a warning about their own vulnerability. Traders hear tighter supply risk. Tehran hears an attack not only on territory, but on sovereignty itself. And Washington, whether it admits it or not, would be crossing a dangerous threshold, from coercing behavior to potentially trying to control the economic engine of an enemy state. This is the real meaning of Kharg Island. It is not just one piece of land. It is a test of how far the United States is willing to go in merging military force with resource control. It is the point where a tactical option becomes a strategic confession. Because once Kharg Island moves from threat to objective, the war is no longer simply about limiting Iran. It becomes a war over who gets to command the economic lifeline at the center of the conflict. And wars built around that kind of logic rarely stay small for long. Part 3, Hormuz, Oil, and Inflation, How a Regional War Hits the American Kitchen Table. The Strait of Hormuz may sit thousands of miles away from most American households, but when a war begins to tighten around that narrow waterway, the distance becomes an illusion. The truth is simple and brutal: when oil routes are threatened, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It moves through tankers, insurers, traders, refiners, freight networks, and financial markets until it lands in the most ordinary places in American life: the gas pump, the grocery aisle, the monthly utility bill, the airline ticket, and the quiet anxiety of families already stretched by rising costs. That is why this part of the story matters so much. The war is not only about bombs, threats, and diplomacy. It is about how strategic pressure in one region can become inflationary pain in another. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a map reference. It is one of the most important choke points in the world economy. A massive share of global oil and gas flows through that corridor. When Trump talks about taking Iran's oil, and when the broader war raises the risk of conflict around shipping lanes, the market hears something very specific: danger to flow. And in energy markets, flow is everything. It does not take a total shutdown to cause serious damage. It only takes enough instability for traders to believe supply may be delayed, rerouted, reduced, or exposed to attack. The moment that belief hardens, prices move. That is where the economic mechanics become dangerous. Oil is not just another commodity. It is the base layer under modern economic life. It fuels transportation, industry, aviation, agriculture, plastics, logistics, and a long chain of goods that most consumers never connect back to a barrel of crude. When oil prices jump, the pain spreads outward in stages. First comes the spike in energy costs. Then comes the rise in shipping and transport costs. Then producers, retailers, and service providers start passing those higher costs forward. The result is not just expensive gas. It is broader inflation moving through the system like a slow, relentless wave. This is the kind of inflation that people feel before economists finish naming it. Families change routines. Small businesses delay decisions. Truckers, airlines, and manufacturers absorb pressure or pass it on. Markets become more defensive. And the political system starts shaking because inflation is never just an economic number. It is a trust issue. It asks the public whether the people in power understand what their decisions are doing to real life. That is why wars linked to oil are so politically volatile in the United States. Americans may support force overseas for a time, but they become far more skeptical when foreign conflict begins rewriting the math of everyday survival at home. The danger grows even sharper because this war is not limited to one point of pressure. If the Strait of Hormuz is one artery, the wider regional shipping network is the circulatory system. Once the Houthis enter the fight and trade routes near the Red Sea come under greater strain, the risk is no longer local. It becomes layered. Now the global economy is not just watching one bottleneck. It is watching the possibility of multiple maritime pressure points at once. That is how a regional war starts behaving like a systemic economic event. And here is the deeper strategic irony. Washington may see pressure on Iran's oil position as a way to weaken Tehran. But energy pressure is notoriously hard to contain. It rarely obeys political intention. It leaks across borders. It punishes allies. It shakes currencies. It complicates central bank decisions. It makes inflation stickier. It weakens consumer confidence. In other words, what begins as external leverage can become domestic blowback with surprising speed. That is the real American kitchen table story behind the Strait of Hormuz. A threat to oil flow is not just a foreign policy development. It is a stress test for household stability, business confidence, and political patience. The public may hear the language of strength from Washington, but the economy hears something else: volatility, scarcity risk, and the possibility of a long conflict with no clean ceiling. And if that happens, the cost of this war will not be measured only in the Gulf. It will be measured in the daily lives of millions of Americans who never voted for an oil shock, but may end up paying for one anyway. Part 4: Boots on the Ground, the dangerous fantasy of a limited ground war. There is a special kind of danger in Washington that Americans have seen before, and it usually arrives wrapped in reassuring language. Not the language of full invasion. Not the language of endless war. It comes dressed as something cleaner, tighter, easier to sell: a limited ground operation, a temporary deployment, a focused mission with narrow objectives. That is exactly why the growing talk around possible U.S. boots on the ground in Iran should set off alarms across the political spectrum. Because once American forces move from offshore pressure to physical presence on contested ground, the nature of the war changes immediately. The promises get smaller. The risks get bigger. And the exit gets harder to see. This is the central fantasy behind the phrase, limited ground war. It assumes that the side with greater military power can control not just the opening move, but the pace, scale, and duration of everything that follows. That assumption has broken down again and again in modern conflict, especially in the Middle East. A president may choose when to enter. He does not get to choose how the enemy adapts, how the battlefield evolves, how the casualties shape public opinion, or how quickly a tactical action becomes a strategic burden. Once U.S. troops are on Iranian soil, or directly holding Iranian strategic ground, the mission is no longer defined by the speech that launched it. It is defined by the pressures that follow it. And those pressures would come fast. Even if the initial operation were framed around Kharg Island, coastal batteries, missile sites, or security around the Strait of Hormuz, the first success would immediately create a second problem: defense. How do you protect the force? How do you resupply it? How do you respond when Iran shifts from absorbing blows to imposing costs? How do you stop a limited operation from becoming a permanent protection mission for the last limited operation? This is how wars expand in real life, not always through one grand decision, but through accumulating obligations that leaders insist are temporary right up until they are not. Iran is especially dangerous terrain for that kind of miscalculation. Not because it is stronger than the United States in conventional terms. It is not. The danger lies elsewhere. Iran has strategic depth, political resilience, ideological discipline, and a long tradition of thinking in terms of attrition, not spectacle. It does not need to defeat the United States in a cinematic battle. It only needs to make American presence costly enough, for long enough, that the political center of gravity shifts back home. That means missiles, drones, mines, proxy pressure, infrastructure strikes, harassment, and the slow erosion of public patience. In asymmetric war, time itself becomes a weapon. This is where history becomes less a memory than a warning. Iraq and Afghanistan are not identical to Iran, but the lesson that matters here is painfully clear. In Washington, escalation is often sold in the language of control and then lived in the language of drift. Objectives expand. Timelines stretch. Costs multiply. The public is told one more deployment, one more strike package, one more round of reinforcement is needed to secure what has already been done. Mission creep is not just a military problem. It is a political habit born from the refusal to admit that the first plan was too narrow for the reality it triggered. Trump's rhetoric makes this more dangerous, not less. When he says a place can be taken easily, he is not merely projecting confidence. He is setting a public expectation that complexity can be crushed by willpower. That may work in a headline. It does not work in a contested war zone. Every easy victory in theory becomes expensive in practice when the enemy decides not to give you a clean fight, but a dirty, patient, punishing one. And that is the kind of fight Iran is structurally built to wage. The real strategic question, then, is not whether the United States can strike harder or deploy faster. Of course it can. The real question is whether Washington has a believable end state if ground escalation begins. What does success look like? A seized island? Safer shipping lanes? A weakened Tehran? A better deal? A symbolic show of dominance? If policymakers cannot answer that clearly before troops move, then the operation is not strategy. It is momentum masquerading as strategy. And momentum is one of the most dangerous forces in war. It pushes leaders forward because turning back looks weak. It narrows debate because caution starts sounding like defeatism. It converts uncertainty into commitment before the public has fully absorbed what is happening. That is how democracies slide into wars they never honestly chose in full daylight. So when Americans hear the phrase, boots on the ground, they should hear more than a military option. They should hear the opening of a trapdoor. Because in the Middle East, limited wars have a habit of becoming long wars, and long wars have a habit of exposing the distance between political theater and strategic truth. Once that distance is crossed, the battlefield is no longer only overseas. It reaches into the presidency, the economy, the military, and the trust between government and the governed. That is the real price of the fantasy. Not just that it may fail, but that it may succeed just enough to keep going. Part 5, Power, Prestige, and Contradiction, What Trump is really signaling. What Trump is signaling in this crisis cannot be understood by listening to only one sentence at a time. You have to listen to the pattern. You have to watch the rhythm. You have to ask what kind of power is being performed, to whom, and for what purpose. Because this is not just about Iran. It is not even just about war. It is about the structure of presidential power under pressure, and about how political prestige can begin to shape military logic in ways that are dangerous for the United States and destabilizing for the world. Trump is speaking to several audiences at once, and that is why his message often looks contradictory on the surface. To Iran, he is signaling domination. To Israel, he is signaling commitment. To his supporters at home, he is signaling strength, confidence, and control. To nervous markets, he is signaling that he still intends to dictate the pace of events. But when one leader tries to project total control to every audience simultaneously, the result is often not clarity. It is overextension. The message becomes louder, but less stable. And that instability matters because in wartime, rhetoric is not just presentation. It becomes part of the battlefield. This is why Trump can say that negotiations are doing extremely well, while also threatening to seize Kharg Island, talking about taking Iran's oil, implying regime change, and leaving the door open to deeper escalation. That is not random inconsistency. It is a political method. Offer the appearance of diplomacy while preserving the image of unlimited force. Speak like a dealmaker and a conqueror at the same time. Keep every door open, not because strategy is settled, but because prestige demands that no visible option appear beyond reach. The problem is that this style of signaling creates a structural trap. Once a president publicly ties his authority to the image of dominance, every compromise starts to look like retreat. Every partial outcome starts to feel insufficient. Every delay looks like defiance. In that environment, policy stops being driven only by national interest and starts being shaped by the psychological needs of leadership itself. The issue is no longer simply what outcome best protects the United States. The issue becomes what outcome allows Trump to look unmistakably in command. That is where the contradiction hardens into risk. Trump's 15-point framework is presented as a path to peace, but from Tehran's point of view it looks much closer to compelled submission. Iran is being asked to give up core leverage, accept deep restrictions, and do so while still under attack and under threat. So when Trump says Iran is close to agreement and Tehran signals skepticism or rejection, both sides are not merely disagreeing on details. They are operating inside different political realities. Washington is speaking the language of dictated order. Tehran is hearing the language of strategic humiliation. And in international politics, humiliation is one of the strongest fuels of resistance. There is another layer here that Americans should not ignore. Trump's rhetoric is not only about foreign policy. It is also about domestic authority. Presidents in wartime often try to collapse the distance between strength abroad and legitimacy at home. They project force externally to reinforce power internally. That does not mean every military threat is fake or theatrical. It means the performance of force becomes politically useful in its own right. The headline becomes part of the instrument. The image of command becomes a form of command. And that can push decision-making toward escalation even when the strategic end state remains blurred. Reports of internal differences inside the administration make this even more precarious. When Trump sounds maximalist while other voices appear more cautious, adversaries and allies alike start reading not just the words, but the fractures behind them. That increases the risk of miscalculation. If no one is fully sure whether the White House wants a deal, a demonstration, or a deeper confrontation, every actor starts preparing for the most dangerous version of the story. That is the deeper truth behind Trump's signaling. He is not simply managing a conflict. He is trying to own the narrative of the conflict, its direction, its symbolism, its emotional charge, its political payoff. But history is unforgiving when leaders become too invested in controlling the appearance of power. Because once image begins outranking strategy, force starts filling the gaps that clear thinking should have filled first. And that is where the danger now lies. Not just in what Trump may do next, but in the political logic that is beginning to govern how he defines success. If success means a stable end to the crisis, compromise is still possible. But if success means public proof of total dominance, then the room for restraint keeps shrinking. And when restraint disappears from the center of power, escalation stops being a risk. It becomes the path of least resistance. Part 6, The Real Endgame, What Comes Next for America, Iran, and the Global Order. The real endgame in this war is no longer hidden. It is now visible in plain sight, and that is what makes this moment so dangerous. We are moving past the phase where governments can pretend they are only testing limits, only sending signals, only shaping the battlefield for better diplomacy later. That ambiguity is fading. What comes next will define far more than the outcome of one conflict. It will define whether the United States still knows how to use power with discipline, whether Iran can survive by turning pressure into resistance, and whether the global order can absorb another major shock without sliding into deeper instability. At this point, three broad futures are taking shape. The first is an ugly but workable settlement. In that scenario, back-channel diplomacy, possibly through Pakistan, buys enough time for both Washington and Tehran to step away from the edge without admitting full retreat. Trump would present any concession from Iran as proof that force worked. Tehran would present its survival as proof that it did not break. Neither side would get total victory, but both could claim enough to stop the slide toward a larger catastrophe. This is the most rational path. It is also politically difficult, because rational endings are rarely emotionally satisfying for leaders who have already framed the conflict in absolute terms. The second future is prolonged controlled escalation. That is the path where no side fully backs down, but no side crosses the ultimate threshold either. More strikes. More threats. More pressure on shipping. More economic shock. More market fear. More diplomatic theater around negotiations that never quite produce closure. This kind of conflict can last longer than many people expect because it allows every actor to delay the hardest choice. But it is also deeply corrosive. It keeps oil markets unstable, keeps regional infrastructure exposed, keeps military forces on edge, and keeps political systems under constant strain. It is not peace. It is structured volatility. The third future is strategic overreach. That is the path where rhetoric about taking oil, seizing Kharg Island, or using ground force stops being leverage and becomes action. And once that happens, the conflict enters a much darker phase. Iran would not need to defeat the United States outright. It would need to widen the field, increase the cost, and stretch the timeline. That means pressure on shipping, infrastructure, regional allies, and the political patience of the American public. At that point, the war would no longer be judged mainly by what Washington intended. It would be judged by what the system could endure. That word matters, system. Because this is not just about Trump and Iran. It is about a larger global structure that is already under stress. The world economy remains vulnerable to energy shocks, supply disruptions, political fragmentation, and inflation that can quickly become social anger. Another sustained crisis in the Gulf does not stay in the Gulf. It moves through fuel prices, central bank calculations, freight costs, investor confidence, and alliance politics. It deepens the sense that the international system no longer has shock absorbers strong enough to protect ordinary people from great power decisions made far away. For the United States, the strategic test is even sharper. American power is still immense. No serious observer doubts that. But the true measure of power is not whether Washington can strike harder, deploy faster, or threaten more dramatically. The true measure is whether it can achieve a stable outcome without turning force into addiction. That is the trap facing every superpower in a moment like this. When leaders begin to equate strength with visible escalation, they often stop asking the most important question: what political condition are we trying to create when the fighting slows down? Iran, for its part, is trying to survive by making itself impossible to dominate cleanly. That is the logic of weaker but resilient states. They absorb punishment, raise costs, and wait for the stronger power to discover that military superiority is not the same thing as strategic control. If Tehran can keep functioning, keep resisting, and keep turning outside pressure into nationalist endurance, then it does not need a cinematic victory. It only needs to deny Trump the kind of triumph he appears to want. And that is where the final danger lies. Trump may still have room to claim success through coercive diplomacy if he chooses discipline over spectacle. But if he defines success as public proof of total dominance, then he narrows his own options. The more absolute the political language becomes, the more difficult compromise becomes. The more difficult compromise becomes, the more escalation starts to feel like the only way to preserve credibility. That is how leaders get trapped by their own rhetoric. Not because they lack power, but because they have mistaken power for freedom. So this is the real endgame. Not simply whether one side wins the next exchange, or whether the next round of talks happens, or whether the next strike lands harder. The deeper question is whether the United States can still act like a great power that understands limits, or whether it is drifting toward a model of crisis management where domination becomes the goal and instability becomes the price. The answer will shape not only America's future in the Middle East, but the credibility of the wider order it claims to defend. The world is now watching for more than movement. It is watching for meaning. It is watching to see whether Washington chooses a hard, imperfect stability or a larger confrontation dressed up as control. And history teaches the lesson clearly: nations are not usually broken by the threats they face first. They are broken by the illusions they refuse to abandon in time. Conclusion: what this story really means. In the end, this story is not only about Trump, Iran, Kharg Island, or the Strait of Hormuz. It is about what happens when power begins to confuse pressure with control, and control with victory. Trump's language about wanting to take the oil in Iran revealed something larger than a military threat. It exposed the inner logic of a conflict that has moved beyond deterrence and into a struggle over money, leverage, prestige, and survival. Kharg Island became more than a location. It became the symbol of a deeper temptation in modern politics, the belief that if you seize the economic engine, you can force history to obey your will. But history rarely works that way. The more this conflict expanded, from Tehran to Kharg Island, from the Strait of Hormuz to the Red Sea, from military strikes to inflation and market panic, the clearer the truth became. Wars are never neatly contained once they begin touching the systems that hold everyday life together. Oil prices rise. Shipping trembles. Markets panic. Families pay more. Leaders harden their rhetoric. And suddenly what sounded like a distant geopolitical gamble becomes a direct burden on ordinary people. That is the real arc of this story. A president tried to project strength. Iran tried to survive through resistance. And the entire global system was forced to absorb the shock. What looked like a battle over territory was also a battle over narrative, over endurance, and over who gets to define the cost of power. And that is why this story matters so deeply. Because in the end, the greatest danger was never just the next missile, the next threat, or the next military move. The greatest danger was the illusion that power without restraint can still produce order. The deeper lesson is one that reaches far beyond politics. In life, just as in statecraft, raw force is not the same as wisdom. Pushing harder is not always the same as moving forward. Sometimes the people who look strongest in the moment are actually the ones walking straight into a trap built by pride, emotion, and the refusal to step back. For all of us, the practical lesson is clear: before making a major decision, ask not only what you can do, but what your action will cost over time. Ask whether you are solving the problem, or simply feeding your ego. Ask whether short-term dominance is worth long-term instability. That applies to leadership, business, family, money, and personal conflict. Real strength is not in constant escalation. Real strength is in discipline, clarity, and knowing where the line is before you cross it. Now here's a quick question for you. Do you think Trump's strategy is mainly about forcing a deal, or mainly about projecting power? A. Forcing a deal. B. Projecting power. Comment A or B below. And beyond that, what is your own view of this crisis? Do you think this ends in negotiation, or do you believe it is heading toward a much bigger confrontation? Share your opinion in the comments so everyone can read, compare perspectives, and join the discussion. Subscribe to the channel to support our work and help us keep bringing you deeper, sharper analysis in the next videos.